I go to Ukraine relatively often. I mean, I try to go at least once a year, and I've been keeping that up for probably about 9 years already. I've made close to 2 dozen trips, maybe not that many. Well, over a dozen, 20 or so trips to Ukraine. And there is what the elites in Ukraine are saying, and I know you're going to talk with Professor Vinitsky from Kiev Hill Academy, right? He studies elites too, right? So there's what the elites are saying in Ukraine, and then there's what the diaspora discourse is in America. And this discourse is coming from all sorts of places. Stakeholders, we're talking museums, Congress committees, youth organizations, organizations for democracy. We're talking maybe not so much in academic spaces because our community, at least in the United States, more so in Canada, but in the United States, isn't represented in the academy. There are not many Ukrainian professors in universities, or if they are, they aren't integrated with what we think of as the traditional diaspora, right? These are the kinds of people who have been, um, you know, in places like the US and Canada since the turn of the last century, um, and have established institutions, cultural centers, museums, churches, and yes, these congressional kind of committees um, to represent, in their own words, to represent the interests of these communities. So that is what I kind of consider the diaspora, kind of a collection of these institutions. And of course, I'm speaking in generalities, but this which I call as a shorthand the diaspora, these people who claim to be representing the unitary voice of Ukrainians living in the United States and Canada. You could throw in Australia, you could throw in Western Europe, but generally I'm talking about English speaking relatively. That's what I refer to as the diaspora. And what they tend to do, and I'm not sure if it's a chicken or an egg type of scenario, is copy what the certain class of European elites in Ukraine like to say. Or is it vice versa? Is there a class of European elites in Ukraine who echo what they hear from diaspora elites, the people who run these organizations in the United States, Canada, plus, and that therefore, when their chosen candidate for the last 5 years, it's been Petro Poroshenko, has been in office, they have a stake in that. And when they invest in that kind of stake in the Ukrainian government, or rather, I should say, the government of Ukraine, they give it their all. It's a zero-sum game. And of course, we saw when Canadian and Ukrainian diplomats, Canadian and American diplomats, did meet with Zelensky before the elections. I mean, they didn't write him off like these institutions which say they represent all of the Ukrainians outside of Ukraine as an ethnic group, because someone decided that their chosen candidate was somebody else. Now, it's not up to me to decide. I have no opinion as to whether or not that chosen candidate should or should not have been Petro Poroshenko. He certainly spent a lot of time with the diaspora. But there was, as I mentioned in that kind of semi-viral Facebook post that I wrote, there is certainly a disconnect and an appeal that other candidates for president of Ukraine were making that Poroshenko wasn't. And these are those uncomfortable truths that you talk about, that Poroshenko during the debates couldn't quite articulate, that elites in Ukraine can't quite articulate, and the people in the diaspora can't articulate because they don't experience these things. They don't live in Ukraine. They don't know what it's like to be fighting for your own life, and what kind of a luxury it is to do a Ukrainian dance and talk about heritage as an intellectual concept when the people in Ukraine may or may not equivocate or find equivalences between that heritage and dysfunction, whether that's justified or not. But we can't, having not lived there, judge them for not prioritizing the things that we prioritize as ethnic Ukrainians outside of Ukraine. There's nothing wrong with us as ethnic Ukrainians having the privilege of living in wealthy countries like the United States and Canada. There's nothing wrong with us valuing our culture, but we need to then separate that from Ukraine, the modern nation state, or the modern state, a liberal democracy across the ocean. Our identities are different than theirs, and our needs are different than theirs, and our luxuries and our privileges are different than theirs. And often people say about the things that I write regarding the community, my experience in this community that I've spent my entire life in, people think that I'm out to get people. I'm not. I mean, these people have done, who run, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. They've done an important and unenviable job that is difficult and very valued. And I mean, I know people who exist outside of the Ukrainian community who maybe aren't Ukrainian ethnically, and they envy our community's organization, right? So I don't want to pretend that I'm not always critical all the time, but regarding you're right. I'm not part of those institutions. I can't be. I mean, I'm a journalist. I do my best, as every journalist does, to be impartial, to be critical, to hold people who are in positions of authority, whether that be opposition or people who are in certain positions of power, to account. I suppose the main difference is, and we could talk about the philosophy of journalism even, is I don't work for the Ukrainian community in the sense that they don't sign my paycheck. I work for the community in the sense that I'm part of the community. My lived experience certainly factors into the work that I do, but I work in a very fast-paced, largely not only American, but white, upper-class, educated kind of space, where many other Ukrainians don't really, I don't know if it's a matter of courage or logistics or creativity, I don't know, but there are many people, really nobody, apart from maybe 2 or 3 other people that I know of, who work in the kind of space that I work in. And that gives me pretty valuable insights, and it does not mean, as some people have implied, that I have, turned my back on the Ukrainian community, or that I no longer want to participate in the diaspora. I mean, there are ethical reasons why I cannot participate in certain things within the diaspora community, as someone who has to defend the interests of every person I cover on my radio program. So, there's an assumption, and there is a belief in loyalty within the Ukrainian communities of the diaspora. And you mentioned this especially with, recent immigrants, novopribuli. It's a question of either you're with us, either you bank with this credit union, or you belong to this Congress committee, or you belong to this church. And if you don't, or if you're not active, then that means you don't care. I can't be active in some of those institutions, probably because I do care, but I have to, for professional reasons, be separated. And there's a lot of people who work hard. I mean, in academia, who there's a lot of people who who want to offer their talents and their insights and their abilities that these institutions, these diaspora institutions, don't really have and probably not necessarily at any fault of their own, but don't have an infrastructure for taking advantage of that. So taking advantage of professional knowledge, whether it be in communications, like both of us are engaged in and have experience with, or whether it's medical doctors. A relative of mine is a medical doctor. There is a Ukrainian Medical Association, and we haven't quite figured out what those things mean. Is it an institution, or should my relative work for Ukrainian ethnic people in America, citizens of Ukraine who live in America? Should he personally work for medical care of ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine, or even non-ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine, as a result of the war? And so many of these questions were, one, unanswered, and two, there wasn't really much of a, an investment in, that my relative ended up working with a non-Ukrainian organization that was simply on moral grounds spending more money and more resources on medical care for the war in Ukraine than Ukrainians were. I wrote it in part because, not that I don't believe that everybody is entitled to their opinion, because certainly most people are. I am in the business of communicating people's opinions, other people's opinions. But when there becomes a groupthink, I mean, people are familiar with, especially Ukrainians, familiar with the work of Orwell and all these things. When there is such a bandwagon in terms of a political discourse where you get shunned and excluded, not for being necessarily contrary to that political discourse, but challenging that discourse, that in so doing you're excluding yourself from the community, that by mentioning things that go unspoken, you almost, your not only loyalties, but your very motives are questioned, and you self-segregate out of the community simply by challenging preconceived notions. That's a problem that I began to notice around the 2019 presidential elections in Ukraine. Again, I have no opinion, perhaps by design, perhaps by the fact that I do work as a journalist, as to who should or should not have won the election. But the analysis for why someone was or was not winning the election, why Poroshenko lost, why Zelensky won, why Tymoshenko lost, all these things were bordering on the frenetic and paranoid, as opposed to the factual motives that people have for voting. Right? We wonder, and in the United States for the last 3 years, Americans have wondered, especially in blue states, in places where there are a lot of Democrats, like in Chicago, like in New York, where most Ukrainians are. Of course, many Ukrainians, not most, but, and I don't know if most, I don't have numbers, but many tend, especially from these diaspora organizations, tend to be Republicans. So, for a long time, you had a struggle, within a lot of these communities, should Ukrainians vote for Trump? Should they not vote for Trump? Again, I don't have an opinion on that. But the idea of that shook up the United States. The presidential elections of 2016 shook up the United States. In the last 3 years, whether you supported Trump or didn't support Trump, people are trying to figure out why he won, given how unlikely it was. I mean, objectively unlikely it was that he would win. And I think the answer many people have settled on was that he spoke to something among voters who felt disenfranchised and were moved either to vote for the first time ever, or who had previously voted for, say, someone like Barack Obama, to move for Donald Trump, or to vote for Donald Trump, right? And we've learned that a lot of these motives are economic in nature. The reasons people have to vote are extremely personal. They aren't even necessarily ideological. They are a matter of putting food on the table. So we talk about the white working class as one of the reasons why people voted for Donald Trump. We also talk about resentment, interracial resentment. I don't want to go off too much on a tangent in this regard, but um, people vote based on their experience. And what I began to notice was that people were obviously voting based on their experience against the status quo, which was by Petro Poroshenko. And so while people like Hillary Clinton or Petro Poroshenko had certainly well fleshed out, articulate, technocratic policy proposals, either those proposals didn't speak to people or they were the opposite of what people felt would help them personally. And like I said, I noticed these diaspora institutions, particularly in the English-speaking world, effectively accusing anybody even entertaining a Zelensky platform as un-Ukrainian. It's as if he's another Yanukovych. And I, for one, hope that time will tell, for the good of the people who live in Ukraine, that he won't end up as violent and as corrupt as Yanukovych. Thing is, we don't know. We don't know. And to now not consider all of the millions of people who voted for him and the reasons for voting for him, I find to be dishonest in the diaspora's avowed support for Ukraine. And I point this out in the text at the bottom of my post, because, and I talked about this earlier, there's the diaspora elites, which are kind of these congressional committees, credit unions, churches, etc., foundations. And then there's elites in Ukraine. The thing is, by virtue of being a citizen of Ukraine, one has a voice. One has a vote about the preferred direction of Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine's elites pretty much united around Poroshenko, right? The European educated kind of elites, right? Kyiv, Halichina. These are the kinds of people who have an ideological preference for mimicking the United States, Canada, Western Europe. And I know for a fact that there are very many diasporas all around the world who, like in Poland, like in Spain, like in Singapore, who voted for Zelensky. But these are places where there is no diaspora institutions, or at least the ones that exist there are very new. And sorry. Yeah, I mean they meet. It's probably not too dissimilar than what our Ukrainian communities looked like in the U.S. and Canada 130 years ago, right? Kind of loose. But here's what I want to say: the diaspora institutions, the legacy institutions that are comprised of elites in the United States and Canada, these are anomalies in the sense that the people who run these institutions, the people who belong to these institutions, are people who, despite the odds, stuck it through. They, in some form or fashion, resisted assimilation into American and Canadian culture. These are people who continue to identify as Ukrainian generation after generation after generation, and for some reason these institutions still exist. And there's a lot of merit to the fact that these institutions still exist. But if we think about the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who came to the United States after World War II, and the perhaps millions of Ukrainians who've come to Canada in the last 100 or so years, 130 or so years, and then we think of these institutions that pull a few hundred people in at meetings, I'm not judging the people who don't belong. I mean, but the fact of the matter is, just like the people who voted for Zelensky probably had personal, economic, and social reasons, very highly personal reasons for voting for Zelensky. These are people who didn't believe in the message of Poroshenko. Likewise, there are people who don't believe in the message of these Congress committees and credit unions and churches in the United States who don't have citizenship to maintain their Ukrainianness, right? Citizenship in Ukraine. So they either form kind of a shadow Ukrainian community, as exists here in Chicago, and in other places. In Canada, I'm sure there are more established institutions that existed for a century, and then there are newer institutions for people who, for whatever reason, have felt or been shunned. And they have highly personal reasons for identifying in the Ukrainian way that they identify too. Problem is, in places like the US and Canada, if that happens for more than a generation or two, and there is no institution with a safety net to catch them, despite assimilation, then they just assimilate, and we lose them. My mother is getting her doctorate in education, and she's writing her dissertation about ethnic schools and heritage language learning. I mean, by the third generation, for example, am third generation Ukrainian. My parents were born here in the United States. My grandparents were immigrants from Ukraine. Statistically speaking, from across linguistic and ethnic groups, by the third generation, there's like a 92 or 93% chance that you do not speak a word of the language of your grandparents. So in my post, I write about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And that supposes, and I talked a lot about the economic factors here, that supposes that to learn Ukrainian in America, I mean, there are a lot of people who changed their names when they came to America for economic reasons, right? These are people who anglicized their names so that they would have better chance of getting work. They basically assimilate into a white American kind of ethnic context, because that is the most socially and economically mobile kind of ethnic, racial, social group in the United States. So people changing their names from, Melnick to Miller or something. I mean, it's just an example. This is something that people did because they needed an economic boost. Now, for some people, like on my mother's side, where they weren't that wealthy, this was an ideological thing. Teaching children and grandchildren Ukrainian was a matter of preventing the kind of genocidal linguistic policies of the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary from succeeding. So in America, in exile, we needed to learn Ukrainian. That was an ideological stance for my family that was relatively poor. And we actually had to, in some senses, take an economic hit for making this ideological push for maintaining our Ukrainian identity and resisting assimilation. On my father's side of the family, this is a family of clergy and a family of professors. These are people who were generally economically a little bit more comfortable, who had homes and had reason. They didn't have quite as they didn't work in factories, right? And so because they didn't work in factories, my father's side of the family, my grandmother, for example, had the privilege and the luxury of teaching my father and my uncles Ukrainian, right? In America, intergenerational language learning, just like intergenerational wealth, is predicated on economic privilege. It presumes that your mother or father are able to drive you to a language school on a Saturday, or that you are privileged enough to have a job in a place where a Ukrainian school exists and you can learn Ukrainian or be around other Ukrainians, right? And for a long time this was a ghetto, but of course nobody wants to live in a ghetto. So for many reasons over the course of history, people learned Ukrainian because the only people that lived around them in a neighborhood in the Lower East Side in New York, or in Bloor Village in Toronto, or in Ukrainian Village in Chicago, they lived next to Ukrainians. They wanted to get out of the ghetto. So what do they need to do? They need to learn English to get out of the ghetto. But in some respects, living next to people who are like you is also a privilege, because you don't have to move to Texas Utah for a job. And what we're learning from new immigrants is they're learning very similar things. You know, are they giving their children anglicized names? Because they don't want them to be bullied in school, and they want school to be about educating to get a good job. Do they want to, um, do they want to move to a place like California where there aren't that many Ukrainians, or Texas where there aren't that many Ukrainians, but perhaps there's jobs in the oil industry, right? So they're making economic decisions that make it harder to have an ethnic Ukrainian identity. They make it harder to speak Ukrainian because there aren't many people around you who speak Ukrainian. We can't judge that. We can't condemn that, and diaspora institutions have made a big mistake condemning that kind of behavior and guilting these people. So instead, what diaspora institutions could do is understand that they got to their position because they had some sort of privilege or ideological strength to get to where they are. But if they aren't to be rendered irrelevant by the fact that there isn't going to be a fifth, sixth, or seventh wave of immigration, that they should figure out how to include these people. They should figure out how to understand the economic implications of maintaining one's Ukrainian identity and cultural aspects of it, but also understand that that life is a matter of highly personal decisions that any rational, economic, social kind of person who cares for their family needs to make. Like, diaspora organizations can't wait another 5 years if they want to continue helping Ukraine. Like, you always hedge your bets if you're a political operative. You always, I mean, like I said, the Foreign Ministry of Canada and the State Department of the United States met with Zelensky before he won, because you always hedge your bets. And it's okay. You may even be all 100% pro Poroshenko. That might be fine. But that does not mean you completely write off and completely ignore the opponents, who the actual voting public of Ukraine are listening to. Because I think there's an interesting relationship between our purported wish for democracy in Ukraine, and then when democracy, I mean legitimate, bona fide democracy, plays out in a manner that we don't like, we're all of a sudden against democracy. I love teaching new immigrants to Chicago about Illinois politics, because it's like 4 of our last 5 or 6 governors have gone to jail, right? And so they're like, wow, America really is corrupt. I thought America was this place where the streets were paved in gold and there was no corruption. And I said, no, we're really corrupt. And they said, but you know what the difference is? American politicians go to jail. Which is like, well, why can't we have that in Ukraine? You know, a place can be corrupt and a place can be fantastic and corrupt, but they got to go to jail. All right, bye-bye. Take care. Thank you.